election this weekend. It's not hyperbole to state that when you change the government, you change the economy. Those old of us to remember the debacle coming from the Kevin 07 era, or indeed old enough to remember the Keating years, or prior to that the Whitlam era, of which not even I can remember, but know the revulsion over his overreaching revolution created in this country. The truth is, as Alan Jones correctly notes, governments have no money of their own, other than what they take from the people, or more accurately, the people who create value. You cannot get blood from a stone, and if you are a net receiver of commonwealth, as opposed to a net payer, how can you be honestly relied on being impartial to a vote between parties? One that wants to grow the pie of Australia versus one that wants to distribute it. We need to grow more of that Aussie pie, with more meat, more steak than sizzle. The sizzle and stealing being from the Labour Party, Kevin 07's razzle dazzle. Remember that? It was all hot gas and no substance, promising, amongst other things, the NBN debacle, costing over $50 billion, with a B, billion dollars, where now Optus and other carriers are starting to roll out 5G super-fast wireless internet. Perhaps some areas were suitable to physically cable up every single premise to a now redundant physical connection in the era of satellites, Google's Project Loon, and wireless, but the fact remains, it sounded good to the Labour Party and the normies that voted for them, despite the cost. We could also go into the abject horror Labour Kevin 07 had with the prospect of being another laborious government during a recession and throwing everything and the kitchen sink against being one, thus one of the few countries who did not have a downturn during what was a worldwide recession. Recessions, as part of a business cycle, are not of themselves a bad thing. They cleanse the economy of bad business and make way for more efficient and better tuned companies for the next wave. If you want to be successful, and not in a union communist sense, the opportunity and rewards and keeping what you have worked for is always going to be better under a conservative government. It's basic math. Labour is planning to extract billions from the wealth-generating section of Australia and give the assets to the socially needy, the robbing of production to give to consumption. If Labour are the socialists and communists wanting to tax, spend, and redistribute like drunken sailors, then the Liberals are the financial accountants, keeping books and not spending above their means. If Australia doesn't want to grow the economy, mundane talk about hospitals and schools and cancer treatments, they don't get funded. Labour is ahead at the polls and cannot grow the economy, only tax and create incentives for the best to go elsewhere, where they will be better treated, while the tax and redistribution continues, taking the money from people by force and spending it where it thinks it should be spent, on your behalf. The ultimate nanny state, where Labour will promise to look after your basic needs. But look how well that goes under a low IQ socialist country. USSR anyone? Venezuela? The people who live under socialism and communism constantly want to go to ones where the free market is. The migrants come from shitholes and then, amazingly, do their darndest to vote for parties that will make Australia a shithole. A truly free society relies on two things. One, the non-aggression principle. In other words, free market economics and keeping your word, contractual obligation. Contracts, keeping your word. Labour has reneged on both of these and promises to lie, cheat and steal to rely on the lowest IQ members of society voting for them and to increase their bottom pyramid to perpetuate their positions of power. Change the government, change the country. They are symbiotic, of course. If you change the country's demographic, you change the government. Imagine if you brought into the country masses of low IQ, very simple, unintelligent people. Who would they vote for? A big nanny state government, promising welfare and sucking from the teat of growing bureaucracy. A cradle-to-grave government, denying the people an autonomy, self-reliance, and delaying gratification. We see the analogy with someone who saves their money and piously reduces their imbibing of drugs, alcohol, and loose women. The conservative ideal versus the sin and villainy of lefty free-love hedonism, where everything is allowed and permissible. The chain-smoking cirrhosis of the liver, festering sores of not disciplining yourself and saving yourself the finances for the future. I mean, this is why we have gambling addicts, drug addicts, and people with thousands of dollars in debt, bad credit cards. Do we want these people voting? Of course, Labour and the Greens rely on these people and count on people not being able to square the circle and be financially or morally accountable. The low R versus K narrative means they just want simple answers and simple fears. The carrot and stick being welfare and climate change. Woo! Glib answers are the mainstay of the left, relying on feels more than savvy squinting inquiry. Alan Jones, as a speechwriter, was told, by liberals obviously, that people know how to best spend their money, not the government. It is, after all, your money, should you have any before or after the government takes it from you. Surprise and revelation, taxation is theft. So, when Bill Shorten was asked on the ABC about the cost of this energy policy, he said the question was dumb. When Scott Morrison asked him in the last debate about the cost of his energy policy, he said the question was dishonest. But there are no bad questions, only bad answers. By deceptively squirreling away from talking about what costs there are, it tells and explains nothing but that we will be collectively taxed $387 billion. That's billion with a B, on a furphy, on a modern-day apocalyptic Armageddon of religious fear known as global warming. I mean, climate change. The current schism, which makes a crisis over the thought that climate change might exist, when we have always existed on a climactic knife edge. Human desire is unlimited. Earthly resources are finite. And spending the surplus of our commonwealth blood, sweat and tears on virtue signaling for soy NPC normies in the inner city to win their vote is akin to treason of the most abhorrent kind. Short-term gains, continuing their position in Parliament, the politicians, with long-term consequences, relegating ourselves to the Keating banana republic we have so feared. This country relies on natural resources. Coal, uranium, something that both China will continue to use, when Australia's usage is about 1.5% of the total world's usage of carbon. We also export, apparently every year, 10 years worth of coal that we would use ourselves. Let me repeat that. Every year, we export 10 years worth that we would use ourselves. Now there is talk about stopping the export of coal. What else will we use versus the manufacturing hubs of Chindia? Of course, you know this conversation isn't fair dinkum since Labour and the Greens refuse to explore the usage of nuclear power, uranium and now thorium, which can use molten salt in the middle of the country to green and water Australia, turning it from a desert into a Frank Herbert Dune tropical paradise. The misaligned and addled taxes of $387 billion doesn't stop there. In case you think $387 billion is now just a funny money figure making a mockery of the current fiat currency that we currently have. The weight on the economy will also be affected by destroying negative gearing, with less investors in the housing market. What will that cost the country and the worker citizen? Franking credits, an incentive to save and invest for retirement, abolished. What is the cost there? There is every incentive for Aussies to invest in true blue Australian-owned companies. Abolishing the trillions invested able to get franking credits means the money will go elsewhere. Most likely to the United States companies, the S&P 500. I mean, a little bit more assured to invest in American business than in butt-fuck Australia. Labour's also giving random policies like childcare payments going up 20%. Well, why stop there? Why not about the other service industries? Does not aged care deserve a raise? What about council workers? What about doctors? Nurses? I know it's hard to get a plumber or a tradie these days. How about a 20% deduction on services paid for by the government? It has no end. The big nanny state government can't help itself but try to be helpful. trying to get involved in every facet of your life and tax and spend and distribute along every step of the way. This is not a good thing. It is a cancer and keeps metastasizing and spreading throughout the country's body. A cleansing way is to reduce the government. If only the people will vote for it. I don't even blame Bill Shorten, Tanya Plibersek, and Sarah Hanson-Young, and Di Natale. These blood-sucking vampires are merely the representatives of the low IQ, selected normies that vote them in. The ones incapable of delaying gratification. In other words, the ones that have spent their savings and now want to take you of what you have stored. It's akin to Aesop's fables of the ant and the grasshopper. The ant stores the food for winter, while the grasshopper spends its summer having fun. Or rather, like the Mongols and the Islamic barbarians who would come in and rape and pillage, taking from the people who farmed the land. In a way, yeah, the situation hasn't changed one iota. The Greens want 100% renewable energy target. Labour only wants 50% renewable energy. And what happens then? To reduce carbon emissions, we then have to stop the farming and the transport. No more planes in the sky. No more cars on the road, unless they're electric. But then again, no coal or nuclear to power them, so it's a flight of fantasy powering it with windmills and solar panels. Hey, look, maybe in the future, you dreamers, but until we get the Dyson spheres that I also am keen on, we need to be using nuclear and coal. I'll even make a deal with you. Put nuclear on the table, and I'll consider stopping our entire coal industry, as mad and as damaging that sounds. Do we really think India and China are going to stop using coal and nuclear power because little pissant Australia is doing so? Are we really that conceited? Or shall I say, are Labour's and Green voters that conceited? But of course, the free market would solve these dilemmas every time. The free market would have coal-fired power at normal prices, while renewables up 60% in cost, and people could decide themselves. You can imagine the low IQ immigrants will not want to pay for higher prices. Of course, high power prices means less industry here and more in China. Surprisingly, a communist country with more advantages to business. As long as, of course, you can handle the corruption and red tape, as in any lefty organization versus a free market. But you know what? Perhaps the saddest thing I have found from this election is the stealing from pensioners $34 billion of their superannuation, which they planned for. And a lot of lifelong Labour voters only now realize, at the end of their lifetime, what socialism and communism means for them. Shorten says when franking credits are a gift, which of course is an outright lie and nonsense, because the tax has been paid on their behalf by the company. If the company was not to pay a dividend, but rather invest it, it would of course be tax-free. If their super fund owned property or just bank interest, because it isn't pre-taxed, they are receiving the benefit in full. Of course, ABC fact-checkers don't talk about this. Low IQ people won't have the foggiest comprehension of this either, much to my shaking of my head. Most people haven't even heard of franking credits or imputation, and no doubt the normies think it's some shady rich person loophole. Nor do they note of the other countries do not tax the accumulation of retirement savings. I also pity the worker at Gladstone Ports Corporation who had the audacity and gall to ask Bill Shorten, who was visiting for a media stunt. The worker asked for tax relief for his colleagues doing overtime and putting their salary above $200,000. Instead of applauding this hard work and giving an incentive to stop the tax rate going from 47% to 49%, that's half of your income to the big taxing government, Bill Shorten, as Alan Jones says, he does not have the guts to tell the fellow he is going to tax the living tripe out of him. Instead he said, "Yeah, well, we're going to look at that." And then the worker was suspended from his position the very next day. Gladstone Ports Corporation is a Queensland government Labour-run apparatchik. Shame on you, Queensland Gladstone Ports. Do not make the dear leader look anything but merciless. And just like with Julia Gillard again, kiddies, if you're not old enough and too wet behind the ears to remember, if the Greens got into government and into bed with Labour, you will have it even worse. as they may be green on the outside, but they are anything but red on the inside. They will supercharge all these misaligned policies to create the communist paradise where we are all poor and reliant on their governments, a la Venezuela. Think death duties. Think 80% Scandinavian taxes. Think of it being even more chattels and cattle of the state than what you already are. David Scully of Marrickville wrote yesterday in The Australian, "Say it for what it is, Bill. A tax on aspiration, inspiration, and perspiration. The more successful and ambitious you are, the lower an incentive for achieving it. The very negative gearing of success." Terry McCrann says it even better on Saturday. Even on the most generous interpretation, what a Shorten Bowen government promises to deliver makes the Whitlam Cairns government of 1970s infamy look like a model of conservative, careful, and limited government in comparison. Labour will throw the elderly, the workers, the middle class under the bus to promise free stuff bribes to young people who don't realise yet there is no such thing as free stuff. No wonder the left wants to lower the voting age to 16. Why not a 5-year-old? It's the same as socialist desires. If you're young and not a communist, you have no heart, or mewling infantile needs. But if you're an adult and don't vote conservative, you have no brain. We vote on Saturday. It's a choice between quiet, conservative, hard-working Australia that cherishes our freedom and responsibilities versus Bill Shorten and the Greens, Labour, Socialist, Banana Republic. Don't become Venezuela. Don't make capital and industry go to free markets like the USA or even China. Make sure you vote for a conservative, careful, and limited government. Remember, change the government, change the country. We saw how that turned out with Kevin 07. Delay your gratification. Ensure the future stays the Australian way.